Welcome back, everyone. I hope the tea got us all enthused. You ready for the next session? So we will now have a panel discussion titled Writing Identity. I now invite the panelists, Professor Gurpreet Mahajan, Swargajyoti Gohain, Uravshi Butalia, and VGeetha, to be on stage, along with the chair, Professor Uday Chandra. Professor Uday Chandra teaches at Georgetown University, Qatar. He's earned his PhD in political science from Yale University. His research focuses on the intersection of critical agrarian studies, political anthropology, post-colonial theory, and South Asian studies. His notable work includes Resistance as Negotiation, which was published in 2024, alongside several co-edited volumes and journal articles. I request the chair and the speakers to please take the stage and the chair to conduct the session. First. It's a bit of a time. It's fine, it's okay. You can just swap the. Yeah, maybe, yeah. It's all right. And I think you want to go after the solution. You want to go after the solution. We start with you. Is that okay? Like just in the order like this. No, it was just because she wanted to go. No, I said I was going on the first day. I start the first every time. All the mics are long. Yeah, that's it. Oh, right. Okay, yeah, this is on. All right, as everyone comes back, it's I want to everyone to be part of the timekeeping as a kind of participatory chairing, so that it's 12:08. This is supposed to be 1.5 hours, 90 minutes. We can go, I suppose, 8 or 10 minutes over time, but we do want to go to lunch and have the final session on time. So I request everyone to be seated, and we'll get started. You probably know most of the people who are here, but I'll briefly introduce, Professor Gurpreet Mahajan, Professor Emerita from CPS in JNU. We have Swargajyoti Gohain, who teaches anthropology in Ashoka University. We have, of course, Uravshi Butalia, who is the founder of Zuban Books and also, the author of many important works on gender and politics in India. And, of course, VGeetha, who has written on caste and gender, and who has, been part of our conversations, all of them in the last 2 days. Let's start in the order that we are. Given the regime that we live in, it is best to start from the right and move to the left. And so we will, 5 minutes or so, for an initial kind of thing on what it means to write identity. So I would like, to focus on both parts of the title, which is about identity, what it means, how you conceptualize it, but also the actual writing process, because that itself is something that students in particular would benefit from, and we want to have as much time for Q&A. So over to you, Geetha.
So very briefly, to me, the question of identity as a historian and as a writer and as a feminist is sort of inseparable from who I am. I was born into a Tamil Brahmin family, and I came to write a book on non-Brahminism. And this was not an easy journey to negotiate in many ways. And some of it emerged out of deep anger and angst at Brahmanical pride, arrogance, and the completely impossible manner in which they wield a hegemony in not just Tamil society, but in the rest of India as well. And living in a state that has challenged Brahmanical hegemony for the last 175 years, I came to this question during the post-Mandal Masjid decade, when the question of caste emerged as significant and important. And also at a time when the Tamil Nadu context, the past and future of the Dravidian movement was being interrogated by a resurgent Dalit movement on the one hand, and by a Tamil nationalist movement on the other, which felt Dravidianism was subsuming Tamilness within a broader category. So it seemed useful to go back and look at the history of Tamil non-Brahminism. And that's the context in which this work was undertaken. And while working on the project, looking at the archives, talking to those who had been part of several aspects of the Tamil non-Brahmin movement, and also looking at one's own Brahmanical life world, all these things were central to how I came to negotiate my own relationship to the subject that I was addressing in my first book. It also helped that I wrote it with someone, S.V. Rajadurai, who has a very distinctive public identity in Tamil Nadu, being from a non-Brahmin background, but also being associated initially with the far left. But even who in those days continued to invoke Periyar and the Dravidian movement as central to the politics of democracy in Tamil Nadu. So it helped by association that I was working with someone whose credibility was beyond question. It did not help that I was a woman. It did not help that I was not a non-Brahmin. But I think that is something that's a battle that you have to wage. It's a battle you have to continue to risk to wage. And you don't just do it through the archive. You just don't do it by writing about it. But you also make yourself present in spaces where Brahmanism is being challenged. Whether it's a movement space, whether it's a literary space, and you learn to listen and not talk. That was a very important learning experience, that you listened a lot, that you did not talk as much, that you admitted that every point you could be wrong in how you interpret anything, and that it behoves you to double check on your own responses and your reactions to how you're going to put something down. At the same time, because I was a woman, I also couldn't escape feeling unease and dismay when I was confronted with misogyny from leading non-Brahmin intellectuals. I also had to deal with the fact that I could have my caste thrown in my face if I brought up the charges of misogyny. And then you have to weigh your options. How do you deal with it? It's not always easy. What helped was that I was part of a very vibrant feminist movement in this country, which also, at least in the Tamil context, was distinctively Bahujan and Dalit in its composition. So I think in that sense, coming from within all these spaces to write on non-Brahmanism from my birth location, which one is constantly trying to transcend, but which one can fully never do because it's also a structural location. It's a conversation, and for me, it is in communication, in the building of political solidarities, that the question of identity gets diffused and has a potential to be transformed into one of horizontal comradeship.
Thanks, Geetha. Actually, if Geetha is right, then I'm like, I suppose, center or left of right, if you can have that. So, there are some seats in front here if you guys want to come, 2 or 3, while we have a little moment in between. Let me start by doing what everybody else was doing, which is to thank the University of Hyderabad and thank the team and the Dean for having us all here. Great to be here. I'm going to echo much of what Geetha has said, because both of us in many ways come from a similar location of being deeply involved in the women's movement and of years of being exposed to the act of listening, which to me is perhaps the most important lesson that I have learned as a writer. How do you actually listen, and how do you listen deeply, and how do you listen with respect and attention, and how do you learn to respect silence also in writing? So I'm going to talk about three things in the writing identity. So one is, how do you actually write your identity? How do you write the location from which you are, the class to which you belong, the language in which you speak, the language in which you think, and the language in which you write? All of that influences your writing. And for me, definitely the fact that I am a woman, that I come from the feminist movement after years of involvement in activism, the fact that I'm a Punjabi located in a city, urban, middle class, upper class. I won't say Brahmin because I'm a Sikh, and Sikhs are supposed to have rejected caste, which we don't, of course, but I'm not located at the top echelons. All of those things influence who I am and what I write about. And everything that I write is somehow connected to the multiple histories of the movement that actually made me the person that I am today and located me where I am today. I don't choose necessarily to write on identity, but identity forms a great deal of, or informs a great deal of the writing that I do, and I tend to focus a lot on it. And the latest piece of work that I'm doing, which I talked about briefly when I was here at Hyderabad University last time, which is the life of a hijra. I am looking at the identity question with very, very different glasses. My interactions with Mona Ahmed, the person I'm talking about, and Mona's own relationship with identity, being born into a male body, realizing mentally, being very sure very early on in life that she was female, but seeing the body merely as a corporeal shell which can be changed with a scalpel to convert it into what the mind already knows, and yet grappling with the questions of power that also are linked to identity. So when you choose to move from the male identity to the female identity, for example, even though your mind knows what you're doing, and even though there is a certain certitude that accompanies it, what you are actually doing is taking the step from moving from power to powerlessness in one way. The power that accompanies gender identities, although you may be powerless in other ways. So there's a very complicated relationship of that move. And there is a way in which, and I think we tend to think of identity too much in certitudes, because there is a way in which always, and I saw this with Mona, the male identity lay there to be claimed when she needed it for a particular purpose. And that particular purpose could be as simple as interacting with the police. So it's much easier to interact with the police when you're a man, so you wear male clothes and you go along and you interact with them as Ahmed. And the female identity was there to be picked up whenever she wanted to have a more emotional interaction. So, for example, when my father passed away, she came to see my mother as a woman, and she told my mother, she held her hand and said to her that I know what it's like to be a woman alone. When she had left her home, she was not allowed to go back there ever because she had become a hijra and the family felt insulted by her presence. But they did let her go back when her father passed away. But they did not let her do the things that men do. So the deepest hurt for her was that she was made to sit with the women and not to carry her father's janaza. And that, for somebody who spent her entire life wanting to be a woman, is a very interesting reflection on identity. So I am also very preoccupied with that at the moment in my writing. And finally, I look at identity in my work as a publisher. As a feminist publisher, this question is one that confronts me all the time. The choices that I have made as a publisher are that I will foreground women's writing. Those choices were made in 1984 when the category of woman could be unpacked and was unpacked by us in terms of caste, class, religion, location, etc., all of those things. But as that category has been further questioned by queer and trans peoples, and now the easy distinction between biology and socialization, sex and gender is not so simply understood, It makes me also question my practice and what I'm doing. And also you think of it in visual terms also as a publisher. So how do you actually represent on the covers of the books the people that your books are about? We do a number of trans autobiographies, and the convention is that the trans person's face must be there because it must reflect the changes that the body is going through. And yet, is that the only way to represent the trans experience? Because is it only about the bodily change, or is it about many other things? Those are the kinds of questions that confront me as a publisher. And finally, I want to make a small remark here also, again, to do with identity, but also to do with the panel that went before, that as a feminist, I am continually aware, as I'm sure Geetha is, of the position of privilege that we occupy and the power that comes with publishing the margins, within quotes. And I am increasingly convinced that that is not something that you can do if you do not allow, I'm sorry to use the word allow, if the margins, those who belong to the margins, do not have a say and a stake in what you're publishing. So the question for me also is, how do we open up this political practice in such a way that the power to select which voices are heard does not only stay with someone like me, who belongs to a different class? And the question I had, which I didn't want to ask in the previous session, but Ajay, I'll put it to you now, and you don't have to answer it, is you mentioned that you and Shail Mayaram and somebody else were invited into the Subaltern Collective. You know, how can you have something that is subaltern and by invitation? And how do you have a collective by invitation? And how can you have something that is subaltern that does not include in the very making of that group subaltern identities? So in a sense, that is the feminist question that confronts me, which is to do with identity.
All right, Swargajyoti.
Okay, thank you. And I also would like to thank the organizers for having me here to the chair. And I'd like to apologize for missing 2 days of the workshop. I was at another workshop in Shillong, and yesterday my flight was 5 hours late. So I'm sorry that I am that participant who doesn't attend half the event, because I do not want to be an organizer and have that kind of participant. So I'm sorry about that. I think my encounter with identity began when I started an MPhil program in more than 20 years ago. I was trying to think of what to do for my MPhil, and being from the Northeast, ethnic identity is this gateway concept. There are certain gateway concepts that determine academic access to certain regions. So being from the Northeast, it felt to me that ethnic identity is the best way to enter that region. But when I approached this concept to some of the faculty, some were very excited, but some kind of wrinkled their noses and said, well, it's a passé word. Who writes about identity nowadays? I mean, it's like, because, deconstruction makes certain concepts no longer good to think with. So you are... you're burdened with those concepts, you cannot avoid them, but yet you realize that identity is a concept that erases internal differences, it homogenizes, and so it's not something that it works for analysis. So since then, I think, although I went ahead and wrote my MPhil thesis on ethnic identities, I have a very vexed relation with this idea of identity, and I've tried to avoid it in my work so far, shielding behind more interesting concepts like borders and boundaries, because boundaries are also about identities, but you approach it in a different way. So there have been efforts to try and bypass identity while also talking about identities by using the word identification. Scholars like Stuart Hall and Frederick Cooper and many people have used identification so that, identity is talked about, but as a process of becoming, as a construction. And it doesn't then become stultified into a kind of homogeneous category. But even that has problems because, imagine talking about identification. It's a very cumbersome word. You cannot prefix or suffix it. Like there is this famous article by Akhil Gupta called no, I don't mean that. Well, people talk about blurred identities and shifting identities, but imagine talking about shifting identification or blurred identification becomes very cumbersome. So although this is a concept that works, maybe conceptually, because it is talking about that process of articulation, of suturing some kind of a discourse to self, but to conceptually use it, it becomes difficult. So one has to continue using identities, except to realize that it is, as Gayatri Spivak says, it is a process of strategic essentialism where you inhabit momentarily a position to articulate a politics, because after all, identity continues to be the banner, right, under which we organize our politics. We cannot do away with it, but we have to realize that it is a strategically used concept, and it comes with all its accompanying issues like it homogenizes, it creates these rigid categories, and it fixes people to certain features and behaviors. And I realized this, I think, most when I worked in Arunachal Pradesh. That's where I've done long-term field work. And I realized that there were all these, Buddhist groups who were espousing a kind of Buddhist environmentalism. And that's not new. It's not something new to Arunachal Pradesh. And I'm talking only about the western part of Arunachal Pradesh, where there are these 2 Buddhist majority districts, and they have a lot of similarities with Ladakh, Sikkim, and other parts of the Himalayan areas where there is a predominant Buddhist tradition. And so what happened was that there were 2 kinds of environmental campaigns that I noticed. One was when monks started protesting against state actions to construct hydroelectric projects. So there were anti-dam protests in which monks took part. So that was one instance where they cited the relevance, the importance of the sacred Buddhist sites in the region, and they said that we need to protect our areas which have Buddhist significance from these state-driven development projects. So here, identity seemed to have a positive force in terms of environmental logic. But then there was another campaign where, again, some groups which went under the banner of Buddhist environmental groups, they banned the consumption of yak and beef meat. Now, these have historically been sources of protein for highland people, and even now, although there is a ban, especially in the district of Tawang, people still, the meat continues to circulate in households, and if you go to people's houses, they might not initially tell you that they have those meats, but then if you show interest, they'll serve it to you. So, but then in public, it's not possible to show that you consume these meats, because then the Buddhist groups which surveil the streets are going to pull you up and haul you up and fine you, and maybe even subject you to more public forms of punishment. So here you have a case of the interplay between religion, ecology, and identity having a very kind of a negative connotation. So these are some of the instances that make you think about how identities work. And I'm at the moment, I'm interested in seeing how religious ethics or religious environmentalism, when it becomes the way forward for an environmental ethics, how constricting it can be, because it forces people to be a particular kind of Hindu or Buddhist or Muslim, and at the cost of also creating all these external boundaries so that other people who are not Buddhist, Hindu, and Muslim cannot claim that same space.
Gurpreet. Yeah.
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity yet again. It's on? So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. I'm not going to thank again. I think, when I was asked to be part of this panel on writing identity, and I could see that perhaps one of the issues that always comes up when we hear this phrase, writing identity, is really about whose identity and who's writing about it. And if your own identity is implicated. How is it implicated, and how did you negotiate the terrain, etc.? And I want to say that even though 1995, one of my early books, used this term identities in part of the title, I found that actually the relationship between identity and writing and thinking is a very complex one. And I just give you one or two examples. It's not only that identities then become pure, essentialized, and then start monitoring. What also happens is that the word identity actually flags in two elements. One is a collective group identity, borders and, forms of differentiation from the other. The other is a space of personal identity which people seek even within that collective. So there's a double process of heterogeneity that's on. And in the second category, it is you are negotiating not only between your socially ascribed subject position, but also along with that, a diversity of experiences in different locales, in different settings, that is also shaping your thinking. So if I were to be asked, as Uday had asked us to do some bit of self-reflection of one's journey, all I would say is there's a strange congruence. I began my academic work thinking that I'm working with intellectual curiosity, because one of my early writing MPhil was on difference between Hegelian and Marxist dialectic. So we won't get there at all. But the idea was that it was the context in which I was living, thinking, and negotiating the world through the lens of, let's say, what was being told in terms of concepts within Marxism, that this journey began. But it's implicated in your experience. So your subject position has these multiple dimensions. Your academic work links to those subject locations in complex ways, not just in terms of your larger social group location, but also your individual experiential position. And that led one to think, and I was in a university which was thinking about how to make the campus more diverse and inclusive. So you begin to start thinking of those categories, and if I'm only retrospectively attributing that perhaps the title of my second book on identities and rights, aspects of liberal democracy in India, liberal democracy in India, came from that perhaps not entirely clear to me then subject position, where we were thinking about these kinds of concepts. So there is academic work which has an element of intellectual curiosity, and I only saw it as that, but it was linked to one's experience, to the world in which we were living concretely, and then more distantly, you find that it actually is getting linked to something else, and you begin to read certain kinds of things and say, what are the different forms of ways in which you might think in terms of diversity? Brought in the word difference, and then I started thinking in terms of does difference require different ways of dealing with difference, in different situations? So is segregation always a form of discrimination? Or you might think forced assimilation is also a form of discrimination. So you subtleties, so there is a complex mix, at least in my own writing and in my own thinking, more than writing, thinking in terms of this complex relationship with what begins sometimes as a curiosity stemming from what you have read or you have experienced. You start exploring it, and actually it links you deeper and deeper with the world of experiences. So at some point, of course, post 1984, which one witnessed and was, after going through that experience, you begin to think in terms of new concepts and categories through which not only others see you, but through which you begin to see yourself. So you begin to accept that identity and see yourself part of that group, because you have similar experiences. So you can come to an awareness of identity and bring that in. I still don't think that I bring that in very strongly, but it has compelled me to think of categories and how we think of categories like minority, majority, identity, difference, and bring that into play to deal with and try to understand our own present predicament, how we might intervene in it. To me, whether I write consciously about my subject position or not, I think somewhere my experience and that vision of what I would like, in terms of what difference I would like to bring to that, becomes a political act and is always present. I'll stop here for the moment.
Thank you very much for those initial remarks. I want to actually continue a conversation that Geetha, you initiated yesterday, which is about writing as a form of embodied labor. And this can mean multiple things. Of course, the one issue that we focused on yesterday was about the gendered nature of our bodies and of the labor we perform when we write. But it's also linked to a wider political economy of work and leisure that I suppose we were all also engaged with. Then there is the question that also brings up questions around caste relations and whose privileges is it that you can sit and write for hours without having to do physical work of that kind. So there are different kinds of labor that are performed, and there is a hierarchy of laborers in that sense that can emerge very quickly. Then there is the other question of ability and disability, right? That the ergonomics of writing is something that many of us have had to deal with, carpal tunnel syndrome and all kinds of other things, but also more kind of structural forms of disability, which then mean that it is difficult to write for various reasons. So I want each of you to think about, to kind of talk about what it means to write. This yesterday was a manual, so today we have the opposite, the antidote to it. So what does it mean for you to write in the forms of embodied labor that you perform in their plurality? Yeah.
Well, I think as a young person starting out life and wanting to be financially independent, one had to obviously earn one's livelihood. And I don't come from a family that has enough money to let me sit at home and write. So one had to therefore negotiate work done outside the household, work done in the household, along with time to visit the archive, to be part of movement spaces to which one was inevitably drawn, and to also write. So one had to basically balance all of these things. And I think in terms of writing itself, for me there was the additional burden that I had imposed on myself that I would write in 2 languages simultaneously, which is in Tamil and English. And I think the labor of writing, which it is something that is for me not quite separable from the labor of work that you do at home, because I can, even now, you literally put something on the stove, you make notes for yourself somewhere, you come back. So there is a certain seamlessness to how you do it, and I'm sure a lot of women would recognize that seamlessness. And secondly, there's also the labor of doing political work in a context where you are an outsider by reasons of your birth. And that form of labor is something that one has to willingly risk and take on in ways that you don't even know what it entails. And I think that labor of being in places where often I would be in a room filled with men, and often I was the only woman. Because typically, in Tamil Nadu, for all the claims we make about social justice and gender justice, Dravidian spaces are fundamentally male. I went on to write a play about it eventually. They are largely male spaces. So for several decades, I or maybe another woman would be the only person there. And there, your bodily comportment, the way people look at you, what are you wearing, all of these things matter. And you have to also make those active choices about, are you going to just be, or are you going to be defiant, or are you going to be just, make sure that no one sees you and that you're just there to listen. But no, we are argumentative, we put our foot in wherever we can as feminists, and you want to make your point of view known. So the whole labor of trying to actually build relationships. Because I think one of the things also is that to identify with this cause in a fundamental way for me was very important, because I felt drawn to it. I wasn't comfortable all the time, but then you had to perform this labor of being part of those spaces and working there in different ways. Some of it involved physical labor, where you would be called to speak on a panel like this, and I would do much of the arranging the furniture, putting up the banner, but you end up doing all of this as well. So I think labor permeates everything that you do in terms of how you write the kinds of things that you wish to write. And the third thing was this whole linguistic thing, because in Tamil, which is a very diglossic language, and which, like all our languages, has several inflections, the Brahmin dialect is extremely distinctive. And one of the first things you learn in politics is that you completely de-Brahminize your expressions. And I'm a mockingbird. I can pick up things very easily. So that was a fun exercise where you completely dropped your linguistic usages as you were used to in your household, and you learned to speak in a common shared tongue. And thanks to the Dravidian movement, there has been a loss of caste inflections in more than one sense of the word, and there has emerged a sort of spoken Tamil which is widely available to all of us. Of course, you can speak in whatever manner you wish when you're in your own space or whatever, but there is a public Tamil which has, so it's a kind of a demotic, democratic language. And I think that's a lesson in democracy, and that is for many of us a deeply existential experience, because you're opting out of something you've grown with. You're using words very carefully. You're not using words for the simplest things, like even the kind of food you eat. That you're not using the word that you would use in your household. And this sort of crossover is also something that one had to work at and work with and all of that. Then the whole embodied thing of trying to understand caste and non-Brahmanism in terms of touchability and untouchability. Because so much of it has to do with touch. What spaces you can occupy, who you can be with, what will you eat, what will you not eat. And also, how do you convey to somebody that you don't like meat and that it's not a Brahmanical thing? So, I mean, these are also things that you need to, and these are serious issues. They are not issues you can take lightly, because it's along these lines of division that hierarchies and various acts of coercion and violence are performed in an everyday sense. But I must say that for whatever one does, I think much of this would not have been possible but for the immense, what I would like to always define as the immense generosity of anti-caste publics. I think the generosity that I experienced within Dravidian spaces and later on within Dalit spaces, when for the last 15 years I've been working on Baba Saheb Ambedkar's writings and doing these public lectures and talks on Ambedkar, the immense generosity of Dalit life worlds. And I think there's also a very interesting difference between non-Brahmanical and Dalit life worlds. Ajay has been talking about quasi-universals and quasi other things. And what I find is there's an antinomian relationship between Brahmanism and anti-Brahmanism. They do tend to get locked into a certain kind of an impasse sometimes. And that impasse is broken by the Dalit life world, which gestures towards a very broad solidarity, a very broad fraternal universe, so to speak. And I think to be made part of and trusted and invited into those life worlds actually mitigated any sense of unease or anything else that you might have experienced while doing your work. And as I said earlier, the anchoring space of the women's movement. Today, of course, the women's movement has to be reappraised in terms of what it managed to do, what it didn't do. But it's very evident that the women's movement also created the possibilities for provisional sisterhood. Not that it could be sustained, not that it could be always sort of available and so on, but I think the friendships and the affection forged in those spaces, which came out of conversations, which came out of intimate fights, which came out of the fact that we were discussing the world as embodied beings. Where would you talk of bodily unease? Where would you talk of the experience of being reduced to a thing by most of the men in your life, if not all? How would you talk about the experience of what Uravashi described, of being in the wrong body, or having the wrong emotions, or wanting to love the wrong people, And I think feminism created, and women's movements created a space for these discussions. And while there were hierarchies and who got to speak and what got heard, these were all determined by who had access to the media, who could write in English, which language was seen as a language of Indian official feminism. All of these mattered, of course. But in all our vernacular life worlds of the women's movement, it was possible to experience a measure of nurture, a measure of affection, with all the other things that come with affection and nature, which are not always singular emotions. There's also control, there's also, mandates that you can't be a feminist this way, you can only be a feminist that way. All of that was there. But I think if all of these together gave me the inner strength and sustained me in the kind of politics that I chose for myself. And I don't think this enterprise of writing is something that has to do with my pen or my head or my archive or my books alone. I don't think this would have been possible if it had not been for the fact, that thinking and writing, as Gail Ombeth and Maria Mais have argued, really comes out of an experiment in collective thought. What does it mean to think collectively? Without any of the negative connotations of the word collective that have come from a certain kind of post-Marxist critique. I think there are other ways of being collective which have to do with reciprocity, which have to do with quietness, with listening. And I think the women's movement spaces made these things possible without romanticizing that possibility, that it was deeply shot with other structural inequalities. I think for me, writing is inseparable from all of these spaces.
Do you want to go in the same order? Yeah? Okay, is it okay if I respond? Because otherwise I'll be repeating many things Geetha said. So I'm going to respond in terms of my work as a publisher, if I may. Before I do that, I just wanted to say, the question that was being asked, I think in yesterday's panel or day before's panel, about people wanting to be writers or knowing that they wanted to be writers or wanting to write. I was thinking of that question. I was thinking back about it that evening. And when I started writing, I never knew that I wanted to be a writer, or I never could articulate that thought to myself, and I was wondering why. And I was thinking back to that historical moment where actually women did not make that choice because they knew they could not make it, because it wasn't an easy choice to make. And yesterday or day before, I was telling Ajay and others a couple of stories from a Hindi writer and Malayalam writer about autobiographical stories about how they wanted to write and somehow just could not because of the burden of domestic duties. So a lot of women, I think, did not think of themselves as writers, did not know how to think of themselves as writers because of this. And when we started our publishing house in 1984, which was at the height of the women's movement, and we were responding to a very strongly felt need in the movement for knowledge, because we were fighting different issues, but we had no knowledge about their history, their economy, where they came from. Take dowry as an example. We were out on the streets battling dowry, but we didn't know how dowry had changed shape, what had happened. So this need for knowledge was what led some of us to think of setting up a women's publishing house. The biggest issue that we faced was not obstacles from misogyny or all of those things that you might have expected, but was women's lack of belief in their ability to write, their pushing down of their desire to write, their need to write, while recognizing how deeply important it was. So for everybody, from the poorest woman to the richest woman, writing meant a great deal, but they feared the act, they feared they wouldn't be able to do it, they didn't have the confidence to be able to do it, and they didn't know whether they would have the time to be able to do it. So that was one of the biggest things that we faced in the process of talking to women and trying to get them to write. Over a period of time, as we managed to convince women that they could write, as we managed to talk to them about it. Another difficulty that we faced, and even though I have said, and that is true, and Geetha has also said that there was a lot of questioning, churning going on in the movement, and there was a need for knowledge and writing in the women's movement. And yet at the same time, there was a very firm belief that activism somehow triumphed over writing, that writing was somehow a less serious act than acting, than getting out there and fighting the battles. that this was something that could be put aside. So that was another sort of issue that we were trying to deal with all the time, that writing was an act of luxury and writing was an act of indulgence somehow. And there is a grain of truth in that, as there always is in these kind of things. So that was some of the issues we were trying to address. And then when it came to, as time goes by and we start to publish more and more, we start to question our own practice, which is that how does it make a difference to the world of knowledge production if, as women, upper caste, upper class, based in a city, speaking in English, publishing in English, we basically reproduce the same hierarchies and same inequalities, except that we replace the gender. So men are out, women are in, but the women are like us. So what are we actually doing? And how do we start to change that practice? So when you start to change that practice and when we started to open up to writing by people from the margins, other questions came along with that. And one of them was, I mentioned it in the earlier part when I talked, that who makes the choices? Where does the power actually lie? So you might actually, publishing Dalit women, you might be publishing Adivasi women, but who makes the choices of whose voices from there are to be heard? So is there a way you can change your practice of selection by bringing in more diverse voices into there, by being inclusive in having people from the margins in decision-making places saying, publish this kind of thing, this is a movement we are supposed, which is important to record, etc. And then you realize when you come close to that, one, how important the act of writing is, how empowering it is, and how much giving voice to what you're feeling is so significant, but then that has to go into the market. So you're dealing with another thing altogether. And there was a time in publishing, forgive me for saying this, but there was a time in publishing, I think it is still on, when saying that X writer or Y writer is Dalit became very sexy. It became a selling point. Now for us, the question was, how does the writer want to be identified? Is this something they want? Because can we gloss over what they want and sell the book as this is a Dalit writer's book? And we made those choices with the writers, and I found many times people wanted to be seen as writers. They didn't necessarily want to be seen as writers from a particular caste or a particular location. So there also, I think the question of identity comes into your practice in different ways, and you have to sort of learn and grow with it all the time. And because I was writing along with being a publisher and learning from the practice, and this is also what Geetha has said, that the kind of learning and the openness that you find is really valuable and significant. Therefore, a lot of this thinking impacted my own writing. But I'll stop here because I can see Uday getting agitated and time is running out. So I'll pass it on to Swargajyoti.
Thank you. So I think I'm an anthropologist. Actually, both sociologist and anthropologist, but in India, sociology and anthropology, as it is practiced in many institutions, are same, uses ethnography. So I think I became an anthropologist because I liked writing so much, and I wanted to write about people. I wanted to engage with the people that I wrote among and with and about. So this kind of engaged writing is not, I think, other people do not do, but it is something that is disciplinary enforced on us, because we have something called field work, where we have to go to the field, we have to, in a conventional manner, stay, learn, listen, and then write about. But I think even this has been troubled by what some people want to put forward as objective ethnography. There was this earlier tradition of an anthropologist going to the field and pretending that all that they got was on their own. They went to the field, collected data as if they were like rocks that you collect from a mountain, and then came back and wrote it up. And so they also claimed that it is objective ethnography or objective writing. And in fact, when I was in my undergrad, I remember writing these long essays on subjectivity and objectivity and how, social sciences are actually not subjective but objective sciences. But you see, these are fraudulent claims to objectivity, and we have now debunked those fraudulent claims, because we have to own up to the fact that writing ethnographically is a very much intersubjective process, because one doesn't go to the field and just collect data and come back and write up. One goes and the anthropological facts are constructed intersubjectively. I go to a field, I ask people, I talk to people, I listen, I participate, I have interlocutors, and I gather those opinions, and I then, of course, there are processes of translation. Even the person who is interpreting their opinion, their views of their own region are also engaged in a process of translation, and I'm further translating it when I receive it and I write it down. So there are these different processes of translation, but to see this as an objective process is, of course, is a false claim. And so we have to understand that ethnographic writing is intersubjective in its very character. And so from here then we have to ask, what is the embodiment? How do ethnographers embody? That's how the subjectivity is an embodied identity. So it is also now accepted in our discipline that we have to not just own and claim, but also foreground it, articulate it in our writing. It's not just a matter of now saying that, okay, it is subjective and it's fine being subjective, but also how to own up and manifest the subjectivity. And so in our writing, we have to also then demonstrate the context of ethnographic experiences, how my subjectivity has influenced my writing, and how I got the data that I'm claiming to represent as ethnographic data. So all these things have to be now made manifest. So I think before writing about other people's identities, one has to also then write about one's own identity in the kind of writing that I do. I'll keep it short.
I want to take this in a slightly different direction, partly because I think a great deal of many interesting things have been said about this quest for how to be true and authentic to what we are dealing with, whether it is on the side of our subject position or in terms of what we are studying, etc. But I want to say that one of the things over the 2 days that may have emerged, at least in my mind and probably in everybody's mind, is that writing, I put it and I'm going to say, is a struggle for most of us. It takes time. It needs that time to visit it over and over and over again. And then obviously the question is, who has the time? Even relatively privileged people may at a certain time feel the pressure. And then there may be priorities within the family, since we are talking about embodied selves, which will say, okay, that's enough, now go back and do something else. And I don't want to say what they would tell you to do, as women, as young boys, or whatever. But there is that pressure. So how do you negotiate? And I think one of the things that helped us to negotiate and get the time and the luxury to read and write and reflect and do it over and over again were some enabling policies like the JRF. I want to bring that in. I think some of those policies, I got a princely sum of 200 rupees a month, which gave us that free time, that time away from pressures of other kind of work, to say, okay, now you can sit and do this kind of work. And that's why we make this plea all the time in the public domain that we need more funding, so that we know writing takes time, reflection requires thinking, understanding, thinking again needs all these kinds of things, and we need that kind of funding and support, without which this is not possible. But that time, we can also do many other things, because it can help you to think better about yourself in relationship to other. And I'll give you just one brief example, that out of those 200 rupees, we could, because this was only given to research students. It is not given to postgraduates and so on and so forth. So you could set aside that money and give to the office in writing that I want, let's say, 20 rupees or 30 rupees out of this to be used for X and Y, which might help or meet somebody else's need. It makes you a better person also. Generosity, all that sense of reciprocity, being a collective in a more positive and enabling way. So I think these are things one needs to fight for if we want to write and even write identity. So to me, that's very, very important. The other element that was very significant in this journey for writing was I want to ask, what are the conditions in which I'm able to perhaps do better in terms of what my expectations are of myself and of other people's expectations are when they want to see something, they have invested in, want some writing, they want to understand how or share this kind of thing. And I think their life in the university is a great luxury. And a university which can bring people from different backgrounds, regions, concerns, ideas. That is the greatest facility to thinking, reflection, and writing. If my writing improved, it is because of that particular context. And that helped me in two kinds of ways. One, of course, it was in environment, not just within the classroom, but in gatherings like this and gatherings outside over tea and such likes, of sharing different points of view, listening, sometimes just combating, and then you're going back troubled self, basically. You are just troubled that how do I either defend my position better or how do I respond to what has been asked. And that's very, very important process for getting out something which is called writing. The other element which I actually learned in the classroom and also outside was to understand, become more and more aware of words translated and seen as not just words but as concepts embedded in theories and paradigms and therefore having specific meaning. So if writing is for the sake of not just self-illumination, which it is sometimes, it's a journey to understand things and make things clear for you, but it's also because you could not write and just think and be clear in your mind. But in the process of writing, you are thinking of others whom you are in conversation with or hoping that you will be in conversation with at some point in time. So communication is important. How your words and concepts may be understood differently from the way you want them to be understood. Are they communicating what you want to communicate? This is something that I got in the university. And that's, I think, a very important and enabling condition of writing. Also helped me to negotiate about writing and identity. Just one last word about, and I don't want to be, but I'm going to be essentialized here and say that, talk about women. Obviously, we were doing all this and we got the time, etc. But that doesn't mean that you were away from the cares of the family and the world and other obligations you have as people located in families, and not men, women, everybody. Women more so, one had to do that. I might say that women are just very skilled and try to manage all these multiple things. And I think all the young people actually are. And they are able to, you have to put yourself out there. There will always be this struggle. But I think were it not for these contexts, maybe my struggle would have failed and I would not have been able to.
Thank you so much. We have a huge turnout and most of them are students. So I think it's really important to bring them into this conversation because it's not just about them kind of aspiring to be writers and writing about identity, but also because they are audiences. And we also write for audiences. Would you like to take this one as well? No, I'll use this. Okay, so please raise your hands and we will take questions in bunches. So like 3 or 4 at a time, maybe even 5. And if you address a particular speaker, you can do that, or you can refer to overall themes. Yes, anyway, your choice.
Hello, ma'am.
Please introduce yourself as well.
Myself, Koteswar Rao from Political Science Department. So, how do we deal with this overlapping of identities, multiple identities, in writing, especially in trying to adhere to the popular academic writing style or rules?
Okay. My answer is best thing is not to write at all.
My name is Maulay Mondal and I'm from Gender Studies.
Ah, okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I can see you as
Yeah.
well now.
So the thing is, I am right now working on my thesis, and especially I'm dealing with queer subject. And so my question is, what I'm facing right now is the using of terminologies. Like when you write, especially post-colonial queer subjectivity, that comes from a very entangled terminological problems we face as students right now. Is some scholars like Evelyn Blackwood, Altman, all people they are encouraging. So this is inevitable. Like we will be using all Western terminologies, theories, and discursive framework. But when I'm writing post-colonial subject, do you think that we need to invent our own terminologies? And if it's possible, then how is it possible? So if you enlighten us a little bit. Thank you.
One more person here, and then there's plenty to talk about.
Hi all, this is Ankur from Department of Political Science. My question is for Uravashi. So before writing identity, it is essential to understand identity. And my question is with respect to fieldwork, with respect to engaging with people from identity different than mine, from locations different than mine. So how does one dissociate from their natal identities and locations, and especially, let's say, with respect to women issues? So if, let's say, I have to work with tribal women, and I, as a person who embodies a man's body, even though being a queer person, but coming from a Brahmin background, have spent most of his life in an urban setup, how can I interact with women from further marginalized locations? And B, how can I unlearn and understand their perspectives without giving it a reading of my own? Or will it always stay a paradox like that, where you tend to unlearn, but are never sure if you are actually understanding the other identities you are trying to work with?
Okay. All right. I think we should go start with the audio.
I want to respond to Shamshed's question, and that anguish is something that different students from Muslim backgrounds have expressed in very clear terms. In fact, there was even a suggestion that a special issue of the Women's Studies section in EPW be devoted to the kind of gatekeeping that Muslim students face today, about what they can write, what they cannot write, what issues are legible, and so on. So it's a question that has no easy answers, of course, but I just want to share a very small personal experience. When Afzal Guru was hanged, all those many years ago, and remember this was before the current regime. So the wound that is Kashmir is a very old wound. And I wrote a play on after Afzal Guru's death, but not on Afzal Guru. I picked up an incident of an encounter death in 1970s Tamil Nadu, and which has since gone. It was a very important human rights case in many courts and so on. And I wrote a play which drew on the structure of Antigone. And the reason I did that was I wanted the person who buries bodies to be the protagonist of my play, who reflects on all the bodies that come to the graveyard. And I was inspired to do this by this frightening study of the disappearances in the Punjab during the Khalistan period, a report put out by the Canadian Sikh Association called Buried Evidence. Some of you might be familiar with that report. So I think there are perhaps ways in which academia, or at least those that students work with, can encourage a more imaginative response to some of these issues than a straightforward anthropological, sociological, or other responses. And because sometimes you simply cannot say what you wish to say in the ways that are usually allowed within disciplinary boundaries. But art, literature, and performance allow a certain latitude. And we all know that some extremely disturbing but creative work has emerged from the valley for several years now. including very interesting graphic narratives and so on. I mean this in all seriousness. Is there a way in which we can think within academic context of allowing a range of expressions when it's not possible to convey the weight and political significance of what we wish to convey through straightforward means? This play was also translated into English. I wrote it in Tamil, and it has been performed in different parts of the world because one of the artists is from here, but she lives elsewhere now. And she performed it in Sri Lanka, where it had a very different resonance, where there are also buried bodies and where you cannot say things. So I think there are ways in which this is possible. This is not suggestion as something you must do or you could do, but I just don't want to feel that we are so completely not able to get out of this situation. And to this thing about writing queerness from within categories of thought that are part of where we are, there has been some work by queer and trans groups into creating vocabularies from within different languages. You might be aware of some of those efforts. But more recently, I came across a brilliant dictionary of queer terminology in the various locations where Arabic is spoken. And they've done an excellent job of how might you use those words, how do you work with it. I think it's available, the link to it is available on jadalia.com. And it's a very fascinating site in itself, but there's this very interesting way in which they've gone about compiling that dictionary and the theoretical questions that they've raised, and it's a very fascinating piece of work. So you might find that somewhat useful.
Okay, thank you. Shamshad, did you and I talk when I was here last? Yes, we did, right? Yeah, I remember you talking about this. So I just will add to what Geetha said. I don't have a formula or a straight answer, and I'm actually sorry that we didn't start by responding to questions. I think that's what we should have done. Then we would have been able to say more of what might have been useful to you. So I think the thing is that you're working, as I think Ankur is and as you are, in a context where academia demands something of you. It demands a certain kind of written product, it demands a certain kind of language, it demands a certain kind of research. And the experience that you are dealing with is really difficult to encapsulate into that. But I think one of the things that you may have here, maybe I'm wrong, which you possibly could not have at home because of the vitiated atmosphere that years of violence have led to, is the presence of something that's really essential to writers, a community that you can trust. Because writing is such a lonely act in many ways that it is really important to be able to trust people and share your work with them and get feedback from them. I think if you have that around you, that may be a way to begin. Another way to begin may be simply to forget the academic demands and write what you feel in your own words, your own feelings, because I think one of the things that we have today as a possibility in academia, where you do have faculty and other colleagues who are open to this, is to problematize this very thing, this stasis, this impossibility of being able to give expression to what you have lived through, because the language is not equal to what you want to describe. So how can you start talking about that? You know, how do, for example, women talk about sexual violence in a society where sex is hardly spoken about? They don't have the vocabulary. And how do you talk about the years of violence that you have gone through, your community has gone through, your parents have gone through? So somewhere just try just writing it in your own language. Try sharing it with people you trust. And see if you can break through that impasse. And then maybe it might lead you to doing something better. Somewhere possibly think, if you can't think of prose writing or personal writing, think of drawing, visuals, think of poetry, think something else, a creative way, or just speaking, recording what you're saying. Maybe it'll help. I'm not sure, but I'm just thinking aloud here. And Ankur, I'm thinking that, I mean, again, your question, where did you go? Oh, yeah. It's a very tough one to answer. It's a question that researchers face all the time. But I don't think it's an impossible one to surmount. And I would say that today, what you have on your side is the fact that people are used to researchers coming in and talking to them. But what you don't have is, and what you should cultivate or you could cultivate, is trust. Because I think that trust and transparency in the researcher and research encounter is the most important thing to build, if you can do that. And because you're young, and because you're queer, it may be easier for women to talk to you. Again, this is a gross generalization, but it may well be easier for women to talk to you. And if you can build that trust, maybe that can be an entry point. And I know that in my own research, and I've talked about this before years ago, when I started, I used to lie to people about why I was doing the work. You know, because I didn't know how to tell them, and I didn't know how to face them because they expected something from me, until a friend of mine told me, "Rubbish, why are you doing this? Be truthful." And then I started to be truthful, and that changed the whole equation. So maybe just talk about your vulnerabilities also. And I think Geetha has already given you that answer, so I won't take any more time because he's agitating over there.
I can respond to the question about overlapping identities because, when we ethnographically write about overlapping identities, how do we do it? And the short answer is that you just have to show how they emerge contextually. What are the different contexts that they emerge? This is particularly is relevant for me because I I primarily based my writing in area in Arunachal Pradesh, which is disputed between India and China. This is an area which was ruled by Tibet for nearly 300 years until the Indo-Tibetan boundary was drawn in 1914. But even after that, the Indian government really didn't demarcate the boundary until the 1950s. People had strong relations with Tibet and still maintained those transnational connections. So there are overlapping identities of local politics, of regional affiliation, of national allegiance, of transnational connections, and they are all present. It's only that how do you trace those identities as they emerge contextually. So, for example, when I was writing or researching origin narratives, or not really origin as in, origin, there are certain origin narratives which trace origins back to an ancestor. So I'm not talking about that, but origins in clans in Tibet, people could still trace origins, movement, and marriage with clans in Tibet, but those only surface in certain narrative forms. The regional allegiance surfaced in the way they are associated themselves with the regional politics of Arunachal Pradesh, with whom otherwise they have a very troubled, with other groups, they have somewhat troubled relationships. So how do you trace these different contexts in which these identities are articulated is something that is something that I've practiced in my writing. And I'd also like to speak very briefly to the question about how does one write in such times. And I think that poetry gives you some license, fiction gives you some license that maybe academic writing cannot, because the moment you say that I'm representing something that's happening actually, it becomes very difficult. So then how do you write social science about disputed areas, right? And here I feel that one has to develop a new craft of writing, new poetics of writing. If we are to write at all, how do we write sensitively, diplomatically, and yet write? Maybe it's not going to reach a very large audience, but yet it will reach an audience and it will sustain. That's it.
I think most of the questions have been addressed, but since I have to leave and this may be the last thing I would be able to say, let me just say a couple of things. One is, and I want to bring in a phrase that we haven't used and perhaps should use, we all are bearers of multiple identities, but we privilege contingently some identity, and that's very context specific in the kind of situation in which you are. And I think you might think about that element of contingently privileging when you're even doing research. Which one are you taking up? Not because you're effacing all other identities and this is the only one. Be careful and mindful of it. But you can easily think in terms of contingently privileging. You can also think in terms of how people negotiate and privilege one kind of identity in a particular context of their life or at a certain moment in their life and yet another, and create a very interesting kind of narrative there. I see another lot of questions which are really concerned with an idea that I have given some thought to, which is the danger of misunderstanding and misrepresenting the other. Okay? I think somewhere one needs to recognize that it's very good to be aware of that, because then you become extremely aware about the ideas and opinions and judgments with which you begin. But after having developed that awareness, also keep in mind that there is no way in which you can say, I have understood fully, because even within that group, or even for that person, if you spoke to them at different moments in time, may represent their experiences a little differently. So you have to think of authenticity and misunderstanding somewhat differently. It's meant to be an awareness about one's positions and ideas and prejudgments. But it's never going to be in a position where you can erase this fully. And if I would bring in a more conservative sociologist, and I think, but there's some sense in what he was saying, that you must hear the voice of the others, but as sociologists, when you go to the field, your concept also adds something. And the interesting example he used, which has stayed in my mind, even in my old age, is that, you go to see the rain dance being performed by the Hopi tribe, and obviously they're performing in order to ensure that rain will come. And you might say, rain doesn't come this year, next year, why are they performing, etc. And he says, no, the sociologists can bring in a concept, say this is an act of social integration. So something about what you are bringing to bear in terms of that conceptual vocabulary of what you're putting together, to put together a range of experiences and name them, this may not be the name they are giving. So be aware that it is not the way they are understanding, but it can also add and open up a new dimension of thinking about that life world, that social world, and so on and so forth. Similarly, I would urge, think of difference and think deeply about what does difference imply. As a post-colonial subject, does it necessarily imply that I will not, and none of the vocabulary that is originating, and Gopal Guru's name you mentioned, Ajay, and I want to go back to it. We were both to speak on a subject in which we had decided the title, which was, Do Concepts Have an Address? That's my short answer to you. So why should you think of that? You will use them with meaning, imbue them with new meaning when you use it in a different context. But now you can give us, copyright over that phrase.
Thank you so much, and I will take another round of questions. But one thing I want to say, and there seems to be an undercurrent yesterday as well as today, that there seems to be students seem to be struggling with the alienation or the alienated nature of writing, academic writing. And as publishers, as authors, you obviously, as a person who reads all of you, I have to say that it's the very opposite of the kind of stereotypical academic writing, which is seen as dry and lifeless and bloodless and so on. And so one of the questions then for me is that how do you kind of put yourself in the writing, which is very important in writing identity, but also that it is a kind of act of meaning making, among many other things, other acts of meaning making that we do. But when we no longer are able to do it, then we have some doubts, then we have certain dilemmas. And perhaps, in fact, we might really feel that there's a threat, that there is a risk and danger of, and perhaps it's better not to write. I also think about Max Weber, who talked about the iron cage, and how Weber himself had a nervous breakdown. And so all the social science, that we've inherited, the mainstream social science, it comes, from this discomfort with the iron cage. And so this is something that, I think all generations struggle with. And this is, so.
Can I just add one more thing?
Yeah.
Weber had a breakdown. Pasternak could not write. He translated Shakespeare.
Yeah.
For the years that he couldn't write.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's another way in which you also deal with censorship and with the inability to speak.
Right. Okay, more questions. Yes, someone up front here.
Yeah. My name is Asha.
Yes.
I'm doing PhD in social exclusion and inclusive policy. So my question is, when I write about labor history, I'm feeling that I'm writing about my ancestors, and sometimes it makes me emotional, and I feel that I'm afraid that I may be biased. And on the other hand, when I read the existing works, sometimes I'm unable to connect it with the data and experience I have. So how I can be more scientific in writing? And maybe I'm posing this question because I'm very accidental to research academics, and I switched my area in between. So I'm from natural science. I switched from natural science to social science. So that's why I don't know whether it makes sense, but this is a personal struggle I'm feeling while writing.
Okay, thank you.
Good afternoon, ma'am. I am Nandini Das, and I'm currently doing Masters in Political Science from this university. So, ma'am, my question to you is, you talked about our identities being influenced by our locals, and indeed so. But I see that locals and the things which are contained in them, they themselves contain some identities. And people like us who are in mobility, they feel these differences. But we cannot articulate them in epistemological terms. Do you think that that has affected the process of identity writing, and how?
Hi.
Yes, please.
Psychology department. Sorry, my question is not very well formed, but just continuing dialogue from Shamshad. If we are saying that we are choosing poetry over academic writing because of, and which is maybe a compromise with state and the negotiating the politics, then are we assuming two things? First is the academic writing is more near to truth because it's direct in comparison to metaphor. That's one. And second is the metaphor has a more affective response than the truth. And I'm mostly drawing from the debate between the Dalit emancipation between metaphor and concept, and there is always a debate what to choose first. So yeah, so are we making this two assumption or not?
Okay.
So yeah.
This young lady in front, yeah. No, let's. Okay.
Good afternoon. My name is Rinto Joy, and I'm from History Department. I have quite a specific question to Swargajyoti Gohain, ma'am. So you were talking about this ban on consumption of yak meat in Arunachal Pradesh. So since you said it was publicly embraced, but it was resented in private sphere. So I wanted to ask, to what extent is this yak meat ban in Arunachal Pradesh a genuine expression of the Buddhist environmentalism, and to what extent is it a performance of a particular Buddhist identity, specifically in relation to what is going on in the center, which is Hindu nationalism? And I'm not very sure about this, which is why I wanted some clarity from you. Because since it seems like since earlier on, there is a conflict. Whenever there is a conflict between religion and the local customs used to had it its way. But now with modernity and the homogeneousness of religion and the more rigidification of what is essentially this religion, it seems like nowadays these local customs are being left behind in consciousness of a larger religious identity. So I wanted to know your views on this.
Okay.
Thank you.
One last question. Yeah. Yes.
Interesting panel. So basically, my question was: as we all know that identity itself is a contested terrain. So we, as young research scholars, how do we negotiate this field? For instance, if me as a woman belongs to privileged background, working on caste or Dalit women, the kind of treatment that I get is different. While the woman who is a Dalit working on Dalit issue, the kind of treatment that she gets is different. In a similar vein, if we deal with the question of environment and climate change also, if a person from privileged backgrounds, they dealt with that question, they were considered as environmentalists and all those things. While if they were from lower echelons of the society, they were considered as Naxals and anti-nationals. So we, as a young research scholars, how do we negotiate this field of identity while choosing particular topic and while we are investing certain time on engaging in some themes? Because I am asking this question because when we read scholars on identity like Stuart Hall, Raymond Williams, Bellux, what we get is we get the sense of breaking the culture of silence. But what we experiencing in the field is different. So how should we as a young research scholar should navigate this field? Thank you.
Okay. 1 minute each, closing remarks. You don't answer whatever you want.
I'm just going to address the thing about concept and metaphor. I don't see them as indivisible in some ways because whether you're writing poetry or fiction or whether you're writing an essay as Ajay wants to write at some point, I think you do curate ideas, emotions, and metaphors in a certain manner. There's a certain constructionism that is at work, and that requires a certain conceptual clarity and a political groundedness. So I think in that sense, even if one were to write poetry, that poetry is going to convey the Kashmirness of Kashmir in some manner. And it is in that sense, I think, one might want to approach creative literature.
Yeah, I just add to that it's not to replace one kind of writing with another, but it is to try a different kind of writing in order to possibly break the deadlock. With anything that some of the things that I was suggesting, because clearly all of you have very specific practical problems also. So it doesn't help to mention Max Weber. I mean, I just think that guys, all these philosophers and guys should be banned from this stage. Not you, but otherwise, I mean, we keep talking of Weber and Heidegger and Ram Guha and XYZ, but we've got real life problems here. We need to talk to each other. So I think that what? I know, but वो भी हो सकता है उसके बिना नहीं हो सकता. अच्छा चलो आप बोलो. अच्छा ठीक है. Okay. Yeah, I mean, yeah, okay. No. Anyway, I'm not going there. I won't talk about them. Everybody else can talk about them. That's okay. But I just think something to break that deadlock. People talk about writing and they say, write X number of words a day, all of those things. Those things are not without value. They do help in some way. But most importantly, if you can actually have a community of people around you to talk to and share ideas with, that makes a big difference. And I will respond only to the other question to say that I think there is no such thing as totally scientific writing. All writing comes from a bias. And I think one of the things that feminists did was to open up the world of writing to the things that had been lacking from it, which was emotion, affect, subjectivity, the domestic, the private. So if that's what you're writing, be proud of it and write about that. It's perfectly legitimate. And I think finally, actually, the change has to come from within the academy. Because within the academy, the kind of rules that, say that certain kinds of writing are acceptable and others are not, that has to change over time. And once that changes, then it also frees up lots of other things.
Just briefly about social science and fiction, I think one problem with social science is that we have to always reveal our sources. And that revelation, that onus on revelation, references, sources, that makes it more, I would say, susceptible to surveillance. And the other thing about the question about meat ban, why don't you co-author the article with me? Because your analysis is just spot on. And it is about local politics being inflected by national bovine nationalism. And yes, that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Sorry about that. I have to catch a flight, so I just wanted to make sure that I'm not the cause of cancellations and so on. Okay. I see your struggle really as being how will I write something which convinces other people and takes them along so that they take your work seriously. It doesn't seem only as your private experience, but appears something which is contributing to what has been constituted as knowledge which needs to be taken seriously, okay, or an output that needs to be taken seriously. And one of the things I think almost all research, especially in India, begins very often with your own experience and a domain with which you are familiar. This is both its strength and a struggle of how to really now make it more universalizable and taken seriously across contexts and across groups. And that's one of the things my suggestion always is to think in terms of your concrete experience or that story or narrative that you want to pursue, but add on to it other narratives, other contexts in which similar experiences of people of the same group or other groups have, how others have perceived it and treated it differently, and that will really make and take it so that it's not make your story strong, your explanation strong, so that it doesn't seem only as something which is a personalized experience. Okay? It will have a claim to universality. Identities are not fixed. Every time we confront difference, no matter, and maybe at a younger age it's more important because you are still in the process of, hopefully one is still discovering oneself, but maybe that time is lost for me, it is yours. So every time we confront difference, it's disturbing. And it may silence you, but I think it is only momentary. You could turn that silence into writing, and that will effectively engage with others. But I think one needs to give oneself some time to think in terms of the idea that our identity is not fixed. It's been shaped by those situations. You're now in a new context. It will pose new challenges and ask you to reinvent yourself firmly, strongly, in new and different ways.
So thank you very much. I think there are two things before we go for lunch. I think there are two things that I kind of got out of this. That while the title of the panel is writing identity in the singular, I think all of you said that even though identity literally means one, we have to think in the plural. That is one. And the second issue is about how we can, whether we move between different kinds of writing or focus on our different kinds of humanistic writing. The question then becomes, how do we reinvigorate it? How do we see ourselves in it? And also kind of strive towards dialogue and perhaps even universality. Thank you so much.